Thanks, everybody. Glad to see you guys here today. Welcome. We're continuing in our sermon series right now. It's called Practical. And what I wanted to do is kind of talk a little bit about some practical stuff that's not just, psychology or whatever, but something that's actually useful in our walk with Jesus. And Seth asked me to talk about something practical like that. So I'm an Old Testament guy, and there was a passage in the Old Testament that really caught my attention recently, and I thought I'd share that with you guys. So we're going to start off here in 1 Samuel 15:4. If you want to turn with me, you don't have to. I'll probably just read through this a little bit here, but a little bit of backstory here. We're going to talk about Saul. He was the first king of Israel, and in the passage we're going to read, God tells Saul that he wants him to go to war against a very bad neighbor, and he wants them to defeat them. But he's very strange with the way God gave him instructions here. He said, I want you to defeat them, but I don't want you guys to take any plunder. Don't take any of the cows or any of the gold or anything like that. Nothing like that. I want you just to destroy all of it. I don't want you to take any of that. Kind of a strange request. It's not the first time we've seen God ask that, but that's what he told Saul to do. Saul was a new king. He hadn't had a lot of experience yet, and so this was kind of important, a step in Saul's career. And so he goes about and does it. So what did Saul do? We find out very soon after that he did defeat the people, the Amalekites, neighboring evil country here, but he kept all the livestock. He said that he killed all the bad livestock, all the ones that were kind of unhealthy. He got rid of those guys, but he kept the good ones, just like God told him not to do. So that night, the Lord visited Samuel. If you guys know who Samuel was, he was one of the great prophets in the Old Testament, one of the last judges in the period of judges before the kings came. And so God revealed himself that night to Samuel in his sleep. And then he said to Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king. He has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. When Samuel heard that, he was very upset. All night he was very upset. Anyway, the next morning he got up and he said, I'm going to go find Saul and tell him what God said. God said a whole lot more than just that one phrase there. But he said, I better go tell Saul. Saul needs to know about this, right? So early the next morning, he gets up. Has a little trouble finding Saul. Saul's kind of hard to find. Well, he finally finds him, and Saul greets him really cheerfully. He says, hey, Samuel, may the Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's command. And then Samuel says, then what's all the bleating of the sheep and all these goats and the lowing of all the cattle around here? I don't think you did obey God's command. And so Saul says, well, it's true. The army spared some of the best sheep and the goats and the cattle. But the reason we spared them is because we're going to sacrifice them to the Lord your God. And we destroyed all the bad stuff. So there you go. You got that. That's gone. And then Samuel says to Saul, just stop. Just stop. Listen to what the Lord told me last night. And then Saul gets a little worried. He's like, oh, what did he tell you last night? It's not going to go well here. Samuel told him, although you may think little of yourself, are you not the leader of the tribe of Israel? It's a strange first start to criticizing his bad behavior, right? The Lord has anointed you king of Israel. Why haven't you obeyed him? Why did you rush for the plunder and do what was evil in the Lord's sight? So I just want to stop there 1 second. This is kind of the crux of what I wanted to talk to you guys about today. So God, before he begins to further criticize Saul, he first touches on what seems to be the source of the problem here. Instead of God just saying, you disobeyed me, you did what was wrong, I'm really angry at you, he says, why do you think so little of yourself? For some reason, Saul had this odd belief about himself that he was insignificant, that he was weak, which is really weird because he's the king of Israel. In fact, he's the first king of Israel, the first king that Israel actually ever had. Why would he think this way? The word here, I looked at the word here in Hebrew. The word is katan or katon, and it means little. So it's usually talked about like little kids or something. My dad used to call me Yonatan Hakatan, which means Jonathan Little One. And I hope it didn't mean Jonathan the Worthless One. That'd be pretty sad, right? No, I actually talked about that later. But he always used to call me that all the time. I think it just means, yeah, Jonathan the little guy. Hey, Jonathan, little guy, what's up? He used to say that a lot. Very cute. But in this passage, although it means small or little a lot, it means in this passage, when you think of yourself this way, an adult, it means insignificant, weak, unimportant. And for some reason, this is how Saul thought about himself. But what God does is very interesting here. He says, this is, why do you think of yourself this way? And then he tries to help correct his thinking. He says, are you not the leader of the tribes of Israel? Didn't I personally appoint you? And then it's kind of a good picture of God, I think, that God is not quick to just judge us by our external actions. We might have some bad behavior, but I think it's interesting that God kind of sees through that. He sees what's the real purpose, what's the real thing going on. And so he says, why do you feel so worthless? And then Saul admits he's wrong. We'll follow a little bit longer here. He says, then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I have violated the Lord's command and your instructions. But I was afraid of the men, so I gave in to them. And again, you're just like, why is he afraid of his own men? Isn't he the king? Couldn't he just say, I'm going to kill all those guys that took those cows? David and other kings would have done the same. Someone would have disobeyed God that much, they would have actually killed him. In this case, Saul was, something in him was unable to stop his own men from doing this. We go back a little bit, and we can see some more clues about Saul. A couple years prior, I think it's a couple years, we have a scene where he's at his coronation. He's getting crowned here. And as Samuel comes out and tries to introduce him to all of Israel, he hides. Saul goes away, hides. No one can find him. You're like, where did Saul go? We're about to crown this new king. And all the people are kind of sitting around waiting, and they're like, where'd he go? So Samuel and the elders, someone had to actually pray and ask God, can you help us find Saul? That's such a strange thing to happen at your coronation, right? Like, let's pray. Let's all pray and ask God where we can find our king. He's kind of hiding somewhere. So they eventually did find him. He was hiding in some baggage. I don't know if you guys remember this story, but it's really funny or sad. I'm not sure how you want to think about it. But so he was hiding in the baggage, and so you're like, why was he doing that? And he finally did come out. They finally grabbed him out of the baggage and kind of showed him to everybody. It's mentioned that he stood a whole lot taller than everybody else. So he's actually a really tall guy. Also, somewhere else in the, I think earlier, it talks about that he was a handsome-looking guy as well. And so you're kind of thinking here, why did this guy think so lowly of himself? What's going on? What's wrong with this guy? It's always confused me, and I never think I got a really good answer about the mystery of Saul. I know there's one little hint that kind of was revealed by Samuel, and he says, I regret that I have made Saul king because he has turned away from me. So we got two problems here. We have a guy that thinks very lowly of himself, and then we have a guy that also has decided to turn away from God. So he can't be healed. Even if God reveals himself to him, even if he says, I found your problem, he can't be healed because of the state of his heart. So, thinking back to my past, I remember my dad and I had a conversation once, and he told me a very interesting thing that kind of really shook me up. He said that the way you think about yourself shapes the choices you make. And that concept really hit me, and I never forgot it. If you really do believe that you are worthless or evil, or that you're just unimportant, or that God doesn't really care about you, you're going to actually start to make choices that align with that belief. These choices, one after another, every day, little by little, over the course of years, they will shape your destiny and drastically affect everybody around you, including the oikos that we keep talking about here. That's serious. That's something that we need to be practical about, right? Unfortunately, we have this problem that I don't think Saul realized that he felt he was worthless. He didn't get up in the morning and say, yeah, man, another day that I feel worthless. And I don't think any of us do either. We think of we just don't think about that stuff. In fact, we usually don't like thinking about things that we don't like about ourselves, right? We try to hide those and bury them so that we don't think about them. We're good at that, right? But as I've learned throughout my life, and sometimes I've talked to some counselor friends of mine, that bad ideas, bad beliefs, poisonous ideas about ourselves, they get buried alive. They stay with us, and they never go away. They haunt us, and we don't even know why. It's unconscious. But what I like about what God tries to do with Saul is that he tries to draw out that, pulls it up from his unconscious and says, why do you think this way? This is not the right way to think. I think that's a wonderful thing about God, what he does. He gets by our behavior and tries to point at the root and say, why? Why do you think that way? Here's the truth of who you really are. Why do you think this way? So one way to get a clue about what we really think about ourselves, and I have a slide if you want to show it here, is by filling in a blank. And the blank is, we have a statement, and it says, I am blank. What would you fill in the blank with there? Maybe at first you'll say something like, well, I'm a father, I'm a dentist, I'm a designer, you start thinking about kind of your role, or your family member, if you're a father, or if you're what job you have, or maybe you've made a ton of money, $1 million bucks, so you're like, I'm a millionaire. You have all kinds of interesting things that you could talk about, right? Depending on your mood, you might have some good things to fill in there, right? I had a good day. I'm a pretty good guy. Or maybe you had a really bad day and you've been having a bad week, or maybe you've had a bad month, or maybe you've had a bad year. And then you'll say stuff like, I'm just not doing that great. I'm not even sure if I'm really a good person at this point. So that really does depend on that. And the more you kind of stare at that blank and kind of fill in that blank with stuff, and the more you're really honest with yourself, I think it helps that you begin to realize what you really think about yourself. If you want to go to the next one here, another one that helps you kind of identify how you think about yourself, what your identity is that how do you answer this question? God thinks I am what? For a lot of my life, I realized that I'm struggling with a bunch of sins and I'm not really doing too well, and I can't seem to get over it. I'm not doing really well. I would answer that question that it says, God thinks I'm kind of a disappointment, kind of not living up to what I think he planned for me. So I would fill that in at some points in my life as I am a disappointment. I'm not measuring up in terms of how God thinks about me, right? So this whole slide really is kind of to help you guys kind of contemplate and think about this a little bit. Since we hide it from ourselves, maybe it'd be a good idea to think and kind of reflect. How do I really think about myself? We have all the really nice Christian answers, God really loves me and all this kind of stuff, but sometimes we don't really believe those things. Deep down inside, we believe something different. And the purpose of this is kind of to say, what do you really believe? And sometimes our beliefs don't match up with what God thinks. So, I would like to read an excerpt from a book. And in this book, kind of talks about this issue. I got to watch my time here. I don't want to go too long. But this book talks about the issue of identity, how I think about myself, and the dangers of what happens when we don't think about ourselves the way God thinks about ourselves, and also the vice versa. What happens when we don't understand who God is, the danger of that. So, excuse me, sorry. So this is the beginning of a book that introduces this problem. When you were young, the life ahead of you is pristine, never opened book. It was that intoxicating new book smell. It had it. You've just cracked the cover and the pages are white and clean. You absolutely know there's a grand story ahead. When you were very young, you could be a cowboy or a ballerina. In the glory of youth, you and your friends are dread pirates, widely adored pop stars, superstar athletes, gallant knights, or a queen whose rule is just and kind. Later, the fantasies begin to fade, and the dreams become a little bit more focused in reality. Maybe you'll be the first human being on Mars, maybe not, or the doctor who cures breast cancer. The story is whatever you want it to be, and you're still in the opening pages of your great novel. But you know, though, that the story will be great. You know you have a destiny and you have a purpose. Some of those dreams are your own, it's true, but some of those dreams, they are hopes of a destiny that comes from God. But as we grow older, some of those dreams begin to fade, washed in pain and cynicism, failure. The edges tatter, the threads grow bare, and sometimes the fabric falls away completely. Something unnamed repaints the horizon. The mundane, agonizing details of life build and build like bricks on a wall. Soon we are too weary of wrestling with our everyday existence to entertain any sort of grand visions of destiny. Even our relationship with God, which seems so wonderful at first, is really starting to dim. We don't stop walking, but we might as well. What toxin is this that we can turn a wide-eyed dream into a grinding drudge? It's as if we all woke up one morning under a curse we couldn't shake. We push on, one foot in front of the other, but we stop wondering why. The next thing we know, we've got rocks in our shoes and lungs lined with dust. The curse is not a metaphor, though. The curse is a lie all of us have bought into. Sometimes suddenly, sometimes slowly, sometimes like a frog in a pot. The lie breaks our hearts and it scatters us in different ways. Some of us find shelter in religious discipline. Some seek solace in asceticism, and some go into unchecked deconstruction, something that our women's groups are talking about right now. Some are driven away completely. Then we place blame on ourselves and others close to us, our religious systems, the government, fluorinated water, or God himself. Some of this blame is valid, for sure. Some places that we should have been the safest perpetuated the lie the loudest. And here is the lie. 2 parts. We do not see God as who he is, and we do not see ourselves as who we really are. That's the lie. Oof, kind of makes me getting a little bit choked up there. We all believe the lie to some degree. Maybe we don't have that same story exactly, but to some degree we've tasted a little bit of that experience. So I want to just quickly talk about my own experience, which actually does have a little bit of connection to that story. Not as much, but a little bit. Kind of a funny story. Kind of sad, but kind of funny. So I'll share it. I was in my 20s, and I actually got into a really bad disagreement with a fellow church worker. And ended up leaving the church. And I was sharing him something that I was struggling with or dealing with, and he immediately attacked me. He was really upset with me. He got so angry at me, he began to tell me what he thought about me. He said, I'm a very serious sinner, a wolf in sheep's clothing. I'm stirring up dissension, and I'm just overall a bad person. And I was just kind of shocked. I was just absolutely shocked by what he said. I to this day, I still can't understand why he said those things. And it really shook me up. It shook me up so badly that I actually couldn't go to church anymore for about a year. And I didn't give up on God, I just gave up on the church at this point. I just felt like, boy, there's some bad stuff that goes on there. So I was kind of on my own, not going to church. I still had a lot of good church friends and friends at other churches, and I still had my parents and other people. So I still had people that were Christian in my life. But I felt like a different person at this point. What he said began to slowly kind of seep into me. I began to start feeling, well, maybe I'm not a good person. I really thought I was. I thought I was doing God's will. I thought I was helping out. And he was really, really adamant that I was a very wicked person. And, okay, I'm going to reject the extreme part of that, but maybe a little bit about that was right. Maybe I'm not really a good person, as much as I thought I was. So I started acting differently in my life. I actually started to cut people off. So I would drive along the road and I'd see someone and I'd try to get over and I'd cut them off. And before I would have been like, boy, that's a really mean thing to do. But now I'm like, you know what? I'm kind of not a really nice guy anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and cut that guy off. And I kind of saw myself like thinking, wow, that was kind of a jerk move. You know, why'd you do that? And this other half of me was saying, oh, you know, whatever. It's cool. So I also noted during this time that I was trying to deal with this. And the way I deal with emotional problems in my life is that I start playing video games. I don't know if any of you guys are gamers, but I just feel like when I'm kind of not in a good mood or when I'm sick or really, really mad or something, I'll jump on a video game. This was my 20s and 30s. I've since moved on. But at this time, this was my go-to. Not saying that's a bad, horrible thing, but anyway, it's just what I did. So this time I decided to pick up a really violent video game because somehow that matched my mood. I started playing it, and this game kind of took violence to a very new level that kind of like made me feel weird. In this particular game, in order to move forward, you had to, of course, kill a lot of people, but then you had to actually keep some people alive and torture them. I can't remember exactly how that happened, and probably not a place to go into it, but I was like, this is kind of weird. I got to torture people in order to get through this game. And some part of me was like, I'm not really that good of a person anyway, so what's the big deal? I'm going to, slam the guy's head into a car or whatever it takes to get some information so I can move on to the next boss. Anyway, so I kept playing the game, kind of feeling like this wasn't a good game. I shouldn't be doing it, but did it anyway. Got to the very end, and I beat the final boss, and I kind of tossed him off a building or something like that. And I kind of felt really great. I'm like, man, that was fun. It was fun to do some bad stuff and to beat up some people. And kind of feels weird that I had to torture people. It kind of doesn't feel like me. I don't know. It's just a video game, but for some reason, something inside me kind of got a kick out of it. I don't know. But I feel really good. And in reality, I just think I'm not a good person anyway. I'm just a troublemaker, according to this guy, and just just kind of a bad person. Maybe I should stay away from church. I don't need to make anyone else bad like I'm bad. I'm not really that bad, but I do think I'm bad. Something in part of me is not good. And this is who I am. So I could play a game about it. I probably won't do anything like that, obviously, but this is the way I am now. I'm not a good person. And I remember, as soon as I finished playing that game, feeling elated, setting that video game kind of thing on the table, something in my head very clearly said, it's time to give up on God, don't you think? It's not something that came out of my heart. It's not something that came out of my thoughts or anything. This was actually something that was very distinct, and it said very clearly, let's give up on God. You're not a good person anyway. Probably not going to be a good thing to go with God. He's not going to like you. And I stopped and I realized what my dad told me a long time ago. Be careful with how you think about yourself. These thoughts, you don't even realize you're thinking about them half the time. But there's more going on here than I think is just, psychology. I think there's a darker force at play in some of these things, the way we think. So I realized I was taking on a poisonous identity. On those slides we had already looked at, I was saying at that time, God thinks of me as not a good guy, because probably sinking deeper and deeper into becoming a bad person. And when I thought about myself, the same thing. I think God and I think the same way. I'm not a really good person. That's what I thought. And then I realized this day, that's wrong. I have to start seeking some help. I got to find out what's the truth. That's not the truth. Obviously, that's a plant of Satan or something, some kind of supernatural thing. So that's obviously not the truth about me or any of us. What is the truth? And so I spent this, the next 10 years really trying to dig down and grab books and verses that really talked about identity in Christ, who we really are, what God really thinks about us. And I kind of wanted to share some of those things with you. One book that really helped me, among many books, is one by John Elridge, The Sacred Romance. Dennis, you had talked to me about that before, really enjoyed that book. his other book called Wild at Heart, talks about the heart, the person's heart, and how precious that is to God and how important that is that we protect it. One thing I wanted to talk about the heart, here, see if I can find my notes, that is important. Solomon talks about the heart. He says in Proverbs 4:23, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. So this is not just like, oh, I better think better about myself. This is your destiny. It's that important. And just so you understand a little bit about the wording here, the guarding of your heart, what your heart is, it's referring to the place where you think, the place where you add 1 + 1, the place where you kind of think things through and reason things out. That's your heart. That's what the Old Testament says. There's another Proverbs, again, probably Solomon. The purposes of a person's heart are deep waters, but the one who has insight draws them out. If you guys ever do a lookup of the word heart in the Old Testament, you might run across a lot of stuff that says the heart is deceitfully wicked beyond all else. It has no cure. And if you guys kind of look at that, you might be kind of thinking, well, what's the point? Okay, if the Bible says in Jeremiah 17:9 that the heart is deceitfully wicked, and I'm reading from the best translation I can find, this is the NIV, the heart is deceitfully wicked above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? When I was in Hebrew school learning Hebrew, we came across this, and I was kind of curious about this since this was an issue in my life, my heart, and this is a demoralizing verse. If this is true that my heart's deceitful and beyond cure, then I can't help myself. I'm going to have a life of, disappointing life here. But when I looked a little bit closer at the Hebrew word here, I realized that the word deceitful means really hard to follow. It's almost, the word is used in Hebrew to describe paths on really steep or very hard to traverse mountainsides. And it's only used that place, that's it, in the Bible. So translators have a hard time kind of trying to understand that. Since the word is only used in normal reasons, in normal ways like paths and stuff, and when you try to apply it to some kind of metaphorical way, it's kind of hard to figure out what that word means. But the way I understand it here is it comes after another verse that comes right after it says, who can understand it? And commonly in Hebrew, we have what's called a parallelism, where you say one thing and you follow it by a very similar thought right after. It's kind of a poetic way of describing some thought. And so what I'm thinking is going on here is the heart is very, very hard to understand. It's very hard to traverse. It's very hard to make sense of. And then right after that it says, well, who can understand it? So I think that the phrase who can understand it is referring to the fact that it's hard to understand. Our hearts are very hard to understand. Our minds are very strange, deep, complex, kind of like a path that's really hard to follow and get lost easily. And so the chapter says, well, who can understand it? And then immediately following it says, I, the Lord, search the mind and examine the heart, like he did with Saul. So we have a God that, even though our heart is hard to understand and follow, we have a God that knows exactly what's going on in there. And that's a really wonderful thing. And with Saul, we see that he wants to find a way to help you. He wants to put his finger on the issue that's deep within your heart or your mind and pull it out and reveal what the truth really is about you. So the books I've read that were really cool, I'm not going to go into those, but I wanted to leave you guys with some things to meditate on. And I left some papers on everyone's tables that talk about this as well. These verses were very key for me in understanding how God thinks about me, my identity, and also how I think about God. Those are the two parts of the lie that hamstring our Christian walk. So I thought I'd really quickly go over some of these and encourage you guys later to look at these two, look at this handout here and go through them. And I find that if you do struggle with thinking of yourself, if you go through that slide and it says, I'm a disappointment, I think you need to read some of these and go through these, what God really thinks about you. So I'll go through them quick here. I think we got to get going. John 1:12-13. Yet all who receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not out of natural descent, nor of human decision, or of a husband's will, but born of God. That's amazing to me. When I read that, I'm like, does that mean I can call myself a son of God? Because that feels almost blasphemous. But that's kind of what he's saying. You're a child of God. You're a son of God. You're a daughter of God. That's who you are. Well, that's a good verse, right? So I kept on telling myself for years, every time I started to feel down, I'm like, well, I'm a child of God. There's some good in me. There's some definitely good in me. Ephesians 5:1-2, we see another interesting stuff. So I could probably say, well, I'm a child of God, but I'm one of those bad children, right? I'm one of the children that, God's kind of unimpressed with. He always has to scold, and he's disappointed in, right? Because, whatever. I'm one of those guys. Maybe I'm adopted or whatever, I don't know. I'm not really loved as much as the other children that are much better than me. So you can get tempted to kind of follow that line of thinking. Well, Ephesians 5:1-2, God's definitely not going to let you think that. Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the ways of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. Dearly loved children. Now, you can't really argue with that. So the whole idea of me being kind of an unloved child, it doesn't work anymore. Going to have to throw that one out. Okay, but maybe part of our identity rests in how we used to be. So some of us, we used to maybe be involved with some pretty serious sins or pretty rough things. And we're going to say, okay, well, God really does love me. God thinks of me as a child, but he kind of has a separate place for me for people that just kind of really screwed up their lives and now they're just dealing with leftovers. So if that's how you think you have a past that you can't escape, think of yourself as, could be a whole bunch of things, drunkards, slanderer, adulterers. There's a whole bunch of things we could label ourselves of because of things in our past that we're embarrassed about, really ashamed of, but we've been forgiven. 1 Corinthians 6:9-11 will help you with that. Do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither is the sexually immoral, nor the idolaters, nor the adulterers, nor the men who have sex with other men, nor thieves, nor the greedy or the drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. And this next part is key. And that is what some of you were. But that's not who you are anymore. You have been washed, and you were sanctified, and you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. We're not defined by our past. Our identity doesn't rest in the things that we've done that we're ashamed of anymore. We've been made new. We have a new identity now. So maybe that's good thoughts on how I feel about myself, how God thinks about me. He doesn't judge my past any longer. He doesn't identify me by those things. How about my activity in the world today? I've found Matthew 5:13-14 really helpful for my identity. It says, "You are the salt of the earth." This is Jesus talking to his followers here. "You are the salt of the earth. What good is salt if it has lost its flavor? Can you make it salty again? You will be thrown out, trampled underfoot. It's worthless." And then he says that you are the light of the world. Again, I feel like that's blasphemous because John says that Jesus is the light of the world. But Jesus says that we are the light of the world. And that gives me a lot of hope. I'm a source of good in this world, a light. And it's not just me. It's anyone follower of Jesus just by his nature is a source of good and light in this world. That's a very hopeful thought to me. So, one last thing I wanted to share about here before we kind of end here is what about God? So we know a lot about what, God thinks about me. God thinks about people that follow him. We have some good stuff here. But I was just thinking, what would be a good thing to share to you guys about how God thinks? What's God like? Because half of that lie was that we don't really know who God is. We think we know who God is, but we actually have a lot of bad thoughts about God, things that aren't really what he's like. And I thought this particular verse was really powerful to me. And I think powerful to anyone that's kind of looking to God to see, is this someone I can trust? Is God someone that is somebody I can go to and, he knows I got a lot of baggage, a lot of problems. I'm not a very great person. What am I going to do if I start to encounter him? Am I going to get judged? Is he going to be angry with me? I'd like to know that before I kind of start walking towards God. I have a good verse for you. Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, Matthew 11:28, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and I am humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The key part there is I am gentle, humble in heart. Such an important perspective to hear. So God thinks about you in wonderful ways, and God is not a very angry and upset person that you might think he is. He's very wants to get to know you. If you feel like you've kind of gone away from him a little bit, have a little distance from him, this is a good verse for you too. Come back to me. I'm gentle and humble at heart. I'm ready for a relationship. I passed out some papers. I guess I talked to this about already, but some good stuff here where we can sit down and kind of look at some of the bad things we think about God. And we have some verses on the other side that says what God's really like. So I would encourage you guys, maybe, if you have a chance, to kind of go through these during meditation time or quiet time. And it's like a spiritual crack. You start reading these things, you get really pumped up. It's amazing. It's amazing to hear how God loves you so much, how he's warm and affectionate, how he's eager to be with you, patient, slow to anger, loving and gentle. And these are Old Testament passages. Oftentimes people think, the Old Testament, God's really angry and stuff. But I included a lot of Old Testament passages here where it says how affectionate, caring he is. So anyway, thank you guys for listening today, and we'll let the band get going.